Today we're jumping into the book of Judges. And wow, what a time in ancient Israel's history. We're talking chaos, constant conflict, and a whole bunch of really unlikely heroes who just pop up out of nowhere. It's this incredible story about a nation that seems to be totally stuck in a loop.
But this isn't just some dusty old story. It's getting at something really fundamental, a question that feels, well, pretty relevant today, right? What actually happens when a whole society just loses its way, when it forgets what it's all about? That's really the big question we're going to be digging into.
Okay, so let's set the scene here. The Israelites have made it into the Promised Land. You'd think, great, time for some peace and quiet. But nope, that is not what happens. The story tells us that God intentionally left some of the Canaanite nations right there in the land. And there was a really specific and honestly kind of surprising reason for it. Now, I know that sounds pretty intense, right? Teach war? But the idea wasn't to turn them into master strategists. Not really. It was about teaching a lesson to the younger generation, the ones who hadn't lived through the big, miraculous conquests. The point was to show them over and over again that winning wasn't about having the most soldiers or the fanciest weapons. It was this constant, difficult lesson in humility, a reminder that they had to rely on God to survive.
All right, so let's get into the heart of it. This whole period is defined by this really powerful repeating pattern. It's a 4-step cycle that just goes round and round. Sin, oppression, repentance, and finally, deliverance. So here's the playbook, basically. Step 1. The people forget God and start worshiping other idols like Baal and Asherah. Step 2. Because of that, God allows an enemy nation to come in and just dominate them. Step 3. After a while, they can't take it anymore and they cry out for help. And finally, step 4, God sends a special leader, a judge, to save the day. And then, well, you can probably guess, after a little while, the whole thing starts right back at step 1.
So let's watch this cycle spin for the very first time. The first judge we meet is a guy named Othniel, and his story is like the perfect, textbook case of how this all works. So, true to form, Israel sins. Then they get oppressed by Mesopotamia for a solid 8 years. They finally cry out for help, and boom, the Spirit of the Lord comes on Othniel. He leads them, they win, and what do they get? 40 years of peace. See, the cycle works perfectly. But, of course, that peace isn't going to last. So, once Othniel's gone, what happens? The people go right back to their old ways, and the cycle kicks off again. But this time, the hero God sends is, well, he's a very different type of character. His name is Ehud. He's a lefty from the tribe of Benjamin, and let's just say his methods were a little unconventional. Okay, so Ehud's plan, he basically assassinates the Moabite king, Eglon, who's described as being incredibly fat, by hiding a dagger and taking him out in private. It works. But the story makes a point of this. This act of assassination, it tells you everything you need to know about the moral state of the nation. Things are getting gritty. They're getting messy. The moral compass is just all over the place.
And here's the crazy part. This one violent, morally gray act of assassination, it leads to 80 years of peace. 80! That's the longest period of peace in the entire book of Judges. It's just wild, right? It really shows you how complex this time was. Sometimes the most desperate actions led to the most lasting results.
Well, those 80 years couldn't last forever. The cycle turns again. This time, Israel is under the thumb of the Canaanite king, Jabin. But the leader who steps up now is someone completely unexpected, unlike anyone they've ever followed before. Her name is Deborah. And you've got to understand, in this super patriarchal world, a woman in this position was unheard of. She was a prophetess and a judge. The story kind of implies that God chose her because there was a serious leadership vacuum. Basically, no men were stepping up to the plate. But people saw God's authority in her, and they listened.
So Deborah calls up this army guy, Barak, and tells him God says it's time to fight. But just look at the matchup here. Barak has 10,000 guys on foot. The other side, led by a general named Sisera, has a huge army and 900 iron chariots. You have to get this. Iron chariots were the tanks of the ancient world. This was a terrifying, almost unbeatable weapon. The odds were just impossible. So, faced with this, what does Barak do? He gets scared. He basically tells Deborah, I'm not going unless you go with me. He's so overwhelmed by the odds that he needs her, the prophetess, standing right there beside him as a visible sign that God is actually in on this plan.
And so they go, the prophetess and the general, leading their underdog army against this military machine. And what happens on that battlefield? Well, it would become the stuff of legend, literally sung about for generations to come.
So the victory song that's written about this battle has this incredible line. It says, "The stars themselves fought from the heavens against Sisera." It's beautiful poetry for sure, but it's not just poetry.
That line about the stars fighting, it was describing something very real that happened. God's intervention was through the weather. A massive sudden storm hits, and the Kishon River flash floods, turning the whole battlefield into a giant mud pit.
And just like that, the battle flips on its head. The Canaanites' biggest strength, those 900 terrifying iron chariots, instantly becomes their greatest liability. They're totally stuck, useless in the thick mud. And Barak's foot soldiers can just swarm them. It's a total disaster for Sisera's army. But wait, it's not over yet. The enemy general, Sisera, he actually gets away on foot. He runs and hides in the tent of a woman named Jael. And in a final, shocking twist, Jael, who isn't even an Israelite, waits for him to fall asleep and kills this mighty general with a tent peg. So in the end, this whole massive military victory was secured by the actions of two women, Deborah, the leader, and Jael, the woman with the tent peg.
And that victory song we mentioned, it's so interesting because it's not just a celebration, it's kind of a national report card. It gives a big shout out to the tribes who showed up and fought bravely, but it also straight up shames the tribes who just sat it out, the ones who selfishly stayed home and refused to help when everyone else was on the line.
This amazing victory brings 40 years of peace. But here we go again. It's the sad repeating chorus of the whole book. Even after this incredible miracle, this obvious act of God, the peace just doesn't stick. You know it's only a matter of time before the whole cycle of sin and suffering starts all over again. So you have a story of a nation just stuck on repeat, right? Seemingly incapable of learning from its own past. And that kind of leaves us with a big question to think about. When you look at our world today, what cycles do you see? In our societies, in our own lives, what loops are we stuck in? And maybe more importantly, what would it actually take to break them?